でもみんな傷つきながら生きてるだからきっと
Hello and welcome. This is Echochamber, where I talk about whatever, whenever, however I want. And yes, I'm just going to be talking off of notes. This is not scripted. This is me rambling, so is what it is. And hello, and welcome to the Trails to Azure spoiler talk. Oh my goodness, I have so many things I want to talk about. It's going to take forever to record this and edit it down to whatever I want. And okay, if you're not going to listen to all this, that's fine. But if you want to take one thing away from this spoiler talk, it's that, honestly, the game doesn't make anything more clear. If anything, we got more questions. It really has a lot of instances where you basically have to speculate a ton just to make things really make sense. I'm just smiling here because, like, yeah, when I really think about it. So the few things I want to talk about in this is, one, let's say 4 different topics. One, I want to go a bit more into my opinions about the story for Azure. 2, I want to go over the final fragments, as well as go back over the Black Records from Cold Steel 2. 3, I want to go into some of my theory of everything stuff and how that has matured. And I would like to, 4, go into some Cold Steel 3 predictions. So I want to cover a lot of shit at the moment. This is going to be a much longer episode than I ever want it to be. So let's see how long this ends up being. So in the end, Azure really felt like it felt like an extension of Zero, in the same way Cold Steel 2 and Second Chapter did. I think when I talked about Second Chapter, I talked about how it felt like a much better sequel to to Sky than Cold Steel 2 was to Cold Steel. Azure was a very good sequel while also being a very good game in its own right. So I said in it, and I think I'll stand by it's probably my favorite game in the series. It's not a ton over, but it's I'd say a level above where I have Cold Steel and Zero at the moment. And then below that, I'd probably put Second Chapter, and below that, probably Sky the Third. I'm not sure, those two I'm sort of jumping between because they're so different that it's hard to compare which one I'd like more. I like them right around that same level though. And then after that, Cold Steel 2, and then First Chapter, for the reasons I've stated in the past. Both Zero and Azure had really quick endings, and when I think back onto First Chapter and Second Chapter, Sky the Third, they actually had quick endings themselves, but none of them felt as abrupt as Zero or Azure. It's a negative ultimately, but it's not that big of one. It's hard to soak everything in. Cold Steel had it had an abrupt ending, but it made sense because it was a giant, massive cliffhanger. And Cold Steel 2 had the longest fucking ending ever. I remember going through the advertisement chapter, and as much as I'd like to go back and do that, I don't think I have the time or the will to go back and try to get something up to the point where I could do that properly. I don't know if my old Vita save from when I was originally playing that has a save around that time. I was never planning that far ahead, and yeah, I'm not about to play the PS4 stuff. I never got to the point of actually playing all those. So it's a really abrupt ending, and the thing that really stands out to me is that there's so many things that aren't even close to being explained. It's like hard to complain too much, because when I think back on the previous games, it's like, yeah, that's not exactly new. Like, that's actually pretty common. When I think back on like what actually happened with the previous games, it's not new. It's hard for me to be too mad, but maybe I had more expectations because they introduce all these ideas, causality and all that sort of stuff. There's things that are introduced and explained in a very vague sense and all those sorts of things. Like the twist at the end with Kia. The brainwashing, as I want to call it, the cute causality concept. And I think I understand how it works because they really did not explain. I don't know if a better translation would have explained it better, but they really did not explain it. So the idea is that Mirage controls two things, basically. And she didn't have space and time. She wasn't actually affecting causality the more I think about it. At the points when she was doing all this stuff to influence people. It influences perception and sort of causality, more so luck, that sort of concept. The karma, as I believe someone corrected the translation in there, it meant something more along the lines of causality. Essentially the idea that it makes things go your way, essentially. Honestly, I feel like that was supposed to be a big reveal, and it was a significant reveal, but the more I think about it, the less consequential it feels, essentially. Because it feels like really what she was doing was she was just basically taking little events and making her seem more cute, more lovable, that sort of stuff, and not necessarily messing with people's minds as much as she was making situations go in her favor more often. That's what it really felt like was happening. So she couldn't control time by going back and changing things. She couldn't control space by doing anything anywhere she wanted, but she could affect Mirage at that moment around herself, basically. And that's basically the impression I got. And that's the same reason I believe that's how her powers worked in general. That's why she had stuff like the cooking always going well. That's why things always seem to go correctly, like directly around her. That sort of thing. And I sort of get the impression, and this is going a bit more out on the limb, that Kia, the reason she needed an eminent personality, where they apparently took all those cult members and other people and made sacrifices over the years to create her personality, was to make someone with so many traits that it's like you're sort of like overriding human nature in a way to make someone who just has things go their way based on their personality alone. And that would be how it's actually recreated, by combining that personality with, I don't know what the alchemy did technically, but maybe it infused her with a bunch of something. I don't know how sept-terrions work. But I feel as though she had to be the core because of the personality specifically. And that's ultimately how the sept-terrion of Zero, Mirage part of it, actually worked ultimately. And I'm still convinced that they used the Oriole sept-terrion powers to give her that, as well as of Time sept-terrion, I'm guessing they got in some other situation to give her all those different powers from Ouroboros. So for my limited understanding and extended thoughts, those are my impressions on what happened there. I'm not really sure. It's sort of hard to tell, but you know. One other thing I want to go into that I didn't really over the course of the end of the game was my opinions on the characters. I'm going to go over the main cast mainly. Lloyd is probably my favorite protagonist. Like the harem stuff, it's like, whatever, I don't care about that. I like the humor in that stuff anyways. I don't watch enough stuff with that sort of type of humor, like anime or read manga or anything like that, that I've ever really gotten tired of that sort of humor, because it's not like it's a focal point anyways. So that doesn't really bother me. But I really do like his personality. I've seen some in my searching of the interwebs ever since I finished the game, where people think he's a bit bland, but doesn't really come off that way. He feels like someone who's very just like, okay, this is the situation, let's deal with it, basically. He's a very good person to go to if you want someone who can just sit down and be like, okay, let's break it down and let's figure out what would be the best idea going forward, that sort of thing. Ellie, I sort of said this in the bonus episode, but yeah, she's sort of like I see her personality and stuff, but if there's any character in the party that came off just a bit, you know, bland and generic, she'd be the one. I don't really have strong opinions about her. Randy's some other fucking laugher. I love him. Randy's awesome. I really hope they do the voice actor well in English, because like I'm obviously going to do the English stuff for Cold Steel 3. He's going to be relevant in that. I hope they do the voice acting well in that, because not a whole lot of voice actors made me feel as though like, oh my goodness, such a good performance. in the Japanese one for Azure, but he was very expressive. It fit what it made Randy much more of a character. It made his character that much more likable and interesting and all that sort of stuff. Tio, I like Tio. It's sort of the same as Ellie in that one of the reasons I like her more is I like the dynamic between the entire group, and that's one of the reasons that make me like them. But I can't say like Tio as a character by herself would be that immensely compelling. Like her backstory with the cults is pretty interesting, and it does define her personality somewhat. But beyond that, I've said it before, the characters I tend to like the most are gonna be the ones that make me laugh the most. So she's not necessarily one of those sorts. Wazi was certainly one of those that can make you laugh. When he actually tried, it really did feel like once he went back to his church stuff that he was just like not really trying as much with that. It came up like in the bonding event a little bit, but outside of that, he felt very much like sort of like serious business. He wasn't that invested in the situation, but he sort of like stepped off the gas in terms of being casual, and that might just be him being professional, but you know. His backstory in that was interesting too. It does share some interesting ideas in terms of the possibility of other places out there that oppose the goddess, as well as the ideas of having wills and septium, which will tie into a little bit of what I will talk about later. That sort of stuff in artifacts and that sort of idea. Noelle. Noelle really grew on me. She started as one of those, and especially gameplay-wise, where it's just like, and like, I never used her gameplay-wise. Like, she had her upsides, but it was never like really matching anyone else in the party gameplay-wise, but personality-wise, she really grew on me over time, because she had that like just bit of awkwardness to her, but she also had that strong, resolute feeling as well, and it really built some really fun scenes, as well as a pretty good character arc for her in comparison to a lot of the characters in these games. And Rixia, I think I may have given a little bit of a boost to my initial impression of her that may have made me biased when viewing other things throughout the games because of the whole assassin thing and the fact that I saw her in Cold Steel 2 and all that sort of stuff. But I like her as a character. Like, she's fun. She's not exactly the type to make me laugh, but she had probably the most interesting, probably like emotionally resonant sort of a backstory and like character arc. Like, I'm trying to think if any other character has the same sort of growth she did, and maybe Randy. But out of that, she had so much growth between the two games, and she wasn't even in the party for much of the time. I'm still really happy that I did her bonding event during the actual game when I went through it, because that really is just a really nice note to leave off on her character arc. It would have been a really disappointing thing to not have had actually as part of the story as I went through it, basically. And then we have Alex. He likes shoes. I remember that about him. I don't really remember much else. He had a point in the story, but it's like, I'm so indifferent towards him. Like, the most notable thing I can think about is that everyone calls him Tudley when his first name's Alex, and no one ever fucking mentions that. Like, I think it was said once throughout both of the games. Like, legitimately. And that's everything I wanted to talk about. Overall, I thought it was a very good game. I'm legitimately at the point where whenever you get into the games that are sort of extended to an international conflict, I feel as though I'm not going to be able to detach my opinion of the overall arcing story from my opinion of those games as a whole, unless there's significant just problems with the game that really make it stand out and go below the basic level of me enjoying a Trails game, basically. It feels like, so basically everything's going to be around that same level unless they have a significant flaw that makes me just bump them down. So, Cold Steel, I never had any problems with Cold Steel, honestly. Maybe it's because the first one I did, but yeah, it's sort of in the same vein as Zero and Azure, where the problems I did have were pretty minor. I thought Cold Steel, Zero, and Azure were all really well paced, and they kept my attention constantly throughout them. And that's probably the biggest part of it. There's little things like the ending for Azure and Zero being pretty abrupt. And the left field turn and Zero and stuff like that, but those are minor to me. Below that, you have Cold Steel 2, where the big problem in that was definitely pacing, where it felt like they had a story and they just sort of dragged it out, where they had a bunch of filler in between the stuff that actually felt like they wanted to have as part of the story. Then you had First Chapter, which it felt like an introduction. It did. The Second Chapter's problem was that, by and far, out of all of them, it definitely felt as though it was the most JRPG-ish. It felt like it was hitting beats, necessarily, when he had stuff like going to the towers and going through all that sort of stuff. Like these elemental towers, and you go up and you do that sort of stuff. It felt just a bit more structured and a bit more predictable as a result. Which didn't necessarily make it bad, but it also means that it's not quite to that, like, level, basically. Sky the Third was such a departure that it doesn't quite hold up to all the different expectations and stuff, where it does what it tries to do differently very well. It doesn't necessarily match like the high points of the series of what I'd expect from it and that sort of stuff. So those are my opinions on Azure. Okay, let's get to stuff like the fragments and whatnot. Okay, let's just read through these. Yes, I'm looking at the wiki instead of looking for anything specific. Let's go through all of them for the sake of it. My name is Jochin Gunther, High Priest of the TG cult 6 years ago. Our sect was on the brink of extinction due to the efforts of the authorities. I assume this has been a bit more updated translation-wise, so this probably is a little bit better than what I would have gotten in-game anyways. It was I alone who was able to escape danger and find refuge in its land of origin. It was the guidance of the Great D that helped me survive so I could realize the ambitions of our sect. Since the time surely will come, I will record data in each of these terminals, on which they shall base the New Testaments. In order to discuss the origins of our sect, I would first have to turn to the abominable history of the continent of Zemuria. The Great Collapse, approximately 1200 years ago, marked the end of an advanced civilization and with it the established order. In the rise of the bloodshed and poverty of the Dark Ages, in their fatigue, the people committed a grave sin. They let themselves to be deluded by the flattery of pompous fools that appeared out of nowhere, and accepted their invented self-centered order with open arms. The foolish Septarian Church and their symbol, the goddess of the sky. The Dark Ages amid its demise, and this faith has spread throughout the continent. Let us consider if said goddess really existed, can we not assume that she would bestow equal salvation upon all of us? However, disparity has not ceased to exist, and we still find people losing their lives over disasters and misfortunes. Does that mean that said goddess discriminates based on upon whom she shall bestow salvation? The thought alone is too ludicrous for words. In the end, she is merely an idol invented by the Septarian Church to amass power. A goddess as such simply does not exist. Having reached that conclusion, our predecessors embarked on a long journey to find a true god. Their efforts were not in vain, for at the dawn of the Middle Ages, in the depths of this land, they found the power of the great possessor in an eternal slumber. She was known as D, which we know as Demiurgus, who had a wheel and bestowed miracles on the people, and then eventually destroyed herself because her perfect personality did not mesh with the contradictions of human nature. So, I actually sort of agree with this to some extent. That's the thing. I think that, yeah, I think that there's no reason for them to lie about the Septarian Church showing up basically around the time of the Great Collapse. Yeah? So that's probably true. I would imagine that they probably showed up in order to try to pull the world in a certain direction. Probably away from whatever caused the Great Collapse, yeah? I'm willing to bet that Eidos does not exist in the form that they claim. If there is an Eidos, it's something that probably exists entirely differently. I actually think Eidos probably has absolutely nothing to do with the Sept-terrions. The more I've thought about it, I think that they come from different sources. One of those reasons being that you can actively connect into the Sept-terrions and whatnot, and it changes you and whatnot, in the way that you see for demonization and such, which makes me feel as though they probably would come from a different source than the supposed creator of the world, right? That'll probably make more sense when I go into my theory of everything sort of speculation later. On Gnosis. Gnosis is a secret remedy made from pleroma grass, a legendary plant which grows directly on top of septian veins. Which, the way the remedy is prepared, gives the units beneficial effects, including increased physical abilities and divine receptivity, as well as drawing out latent abilities. These effects, however, are mere preparations. The real potential lies elsewhere. Gnosis allows users to link their mind to the revered spirit of D. By doing so, D is able to draw knowledge from the connected minds and thereupon stimulate her own growth. When enough knowledge is amassed to achieve wisdom, D will be resurrected. Which I think this basically refers to the same idea like Kia is the resurrection, technically. As in you're connecting to this power source, this knowledge, that sort of thing. Which does make you wonder, doesn't it? How Yochim was able to get that wisdom, but what's-his-face wasn't at the beginning of Azure. Does make you wonder. By doing so, T is able to draw the knowledge from the connected minds and thereupon stimulate her own growth. When enough knowledge is amassed to achieve... Moreover, Gnosis left room for improvement. 5% of the capabilities of the user to limit the supply of knowledge of D would steadily increase. After a period of 500 years of research, our sect has increased the effects of Gnosis, repeated the so-called ceremonies. At the speed unimaginable when we first started, 5 centuries prior to completion of Gnosis within reach, we were hit with an unforeseen obstacle on then. Okay, yeah, the bracers and all that sort of stuff. As the pleroma grass, the foremost ingredient for Gnosis, grows in abundance in the southern marshlands of Crossbell, there will never be a shortage of raw materials in addition to the highly advanced facilities once installed by the alchemists from the Middle Ages in the depths of the Sun of Ford. I was blessed with an environment to do my research, right? So, that's a fair question. Why? Why was there so much Pleroma grass out in the marshlands in the first place? Because it's not like he had been turned into sept-terrion at that point. There's an open question still. On the Divine Child, which is the one that we didn't finish, this very Crossbell is the home of our DG cult and the land of origin because it's the very place we once inherited the Divine Child from our founders. The Divine Child represents the true God, and her existence is therefore the symbol of our DG cult. What appears to be a human girl in perpetual slumber underneath the Fort of the Sun is actually situated on top of an altar in that fort, waiting for the moment of her awakening. For someone to live this long might be hard for us mortals to believe. However, I myself have seen her with my own eyes. The orb is referred to as a sacred cradle. Slumbers a little girl, that divine presence. The sacred cradle was created by the predecessors of our sect, based on the techniques alchemists had learned by studying artifacts. Meaning that, like those phenomenon described as miracles, there's nothing miraculous to be found here. From her era of inception on, the Divine Child via Gnosis has been entrusted with knowledge which can be best described as infinite. Once wisdom is achieved, the Divine Child will awaken to become the true God D. Souls and minds of all people will be gathered within D, releasing the people from the goddess's spell. That's the prophecy left by the predecessors of DG in the Ambition. We shall bring to fruition. That's interesting. And the souls and minds of all people will be gathered within D. So that's what they were going for. Obviously, Maribel and them were going for something different, but that is the potential that people see. I actually sort of believe this, basically, in the idea specifically that connecting to a sept-terrion, a power that is distinctly separate, as Zeit said, a power to rival the goddess, not the goddess's power, as Zeit said, that the sept-terrions are distinctly different, and that's the main thing I take away from this, as well as the connection stuff, which seemed fairly evident by the end. I'm not really sure there was much to be added from looking at this, though. So, oh well. Okay. So, before I move on to the Black Records and Cold Steel related stuff, I want to talk about my theory of everything. So I'm not going to go over any sort of timeline related concepts. I'm If I went into that, this would probably be like a 2-hour-long video if I actually sat down and tried to work all that out. I already spent like an entire day trying to consider possibilities going back and forth. So if I were to say how my opinions have changed from the previous one, it would say that the fundamental idea I had of orbital energy being life energy, a little bit different. I'd say orbital energy now is more akin to being basically more like an atom. And life, consciousness, is something that can be formed out of orbital energy. So let me explain. So this is how I see it. Now, my general theory at the fundamental concept of how everything works. My Septimus people theory. That the goddess is literally the world itself. I imagine this isn't an uncommon thought in this realm of people speculating. And the idea that septian veins are literally just extensions from the source of the original, just like source of energy coming from wherever it is, which would be the goddess, whatever it is. Septian veins head out, and they're the non-manifested forms of orbital energy. They're the maybe highly dense forms, something of that nature, like a solid to a gas, that sort of idea, but not necessarily a solid or a gas, that sort of concept. And those veins themselves, at the beginning, would leak out orbital energy. And those would, in the same way that you can have orbments create earth, create fire, create water, create all that sort of stuff, create the world itself. You have the earth, the sea, the winds, entropy. You also have the higher elements, where you have time, space, mirage, things you don't typically experience in a physical plane, where time, space, mirage are more the higher elements that create the basis for consciousness, where you have time awareness, spatial awareness, and then mirage, which we already talked about, which is perception and causality. Bring all this together and you can basically control the entirety of human existence. Those come together and you have a consciousness itself, where the body around it is realistically just a shell. It's something a manifested soul from those higher elements that came together in the same way the body did from other elements can basically control and interact with the world. It's why you can have a ton of things with actual life to them, or the idea of linking your minds for like the gnosis and stuff like that. Why you have the capability of that, because there's like another dimension and whatnot, which all the higher elements more act on, and you can actually connect things via that way. And ultimately those shells can be manipulated in a lot of ways. You have demonization, you can merge with a sept-terrion, like Wiseman did. It explains why things can change forms, like Zeit, with his divine wolf form and his normal form. It's why you can change that nature. It actually really effectively explains what happened with the happiness stone too. You have the idea that after everything ended, Ragnar hid as a stone, then he used another, less threatening form when he was found by a little girl, and then eventually he comforted her, and then eventually he found an excuse to basically walk away. She got in danger, he came back, saved her, grew fond of her, and then he decided to use his newfound freedom from basically doing stuff with the Oriole to basically stay with her and the other orphans in the orphanage in order to, say, look over them, in a way, in his happiness stone form. That's actually sort of pretty accurate to what Zeit said about Ragnar too. It wasn't exactly a specific thing, but he did say the concept that he has no idea what happened to Ragnar after all that happened. So I think Ragnar's off in the orphanage basically hanging out with him at this point, just as a stone. So one day, if that ever shows up again, just think, oh, Ragnar might be coming. For that girl that I don't remember her name anymore of. You also have the idea of traveling through septian veins. If you remember in Cold Steel, we had the entire concept where we were, at the beginning of Cold Steel 2, where we were traveling to places via septian veins. So our physical bodies were being transmitted along them. They're even literally called spirit paths. You could also do stuff like, say, maybe immortality, because it's just a shell around you, right? If you can control the elements, you could control your body to stay in the same state that it is at any given time, which also leads credence to the idea that, say, Arianrod could be immortal, because that was definitely the idea, that Arianrod was immortal in the actual Lance Maiden, rather than the other idea of her being a successor to the actual true Lance Maiden, in the same way Rixia is. if you take this idea that consciousness life itself is basically made up of those higher elements, you could definitely make sense of how Kia was created. The idea of the blood sacrifices at the Temple of the Moon, where you take their consciousness and you transfer it into a single entity. And ultimately that would mean that anything can be alive. The animists were right. And I had to research this a little bit because I didn't really remember everything about them. But they're the idea that there were living spirits in the actual world. So you could have an actual living consciousness and just connect it to the winds, and Gaius would be right, man. Gaius was fucking right. Believe in the winds. It will save you. This would also explain why higher element places tend to have ghosts and stuff. It has they have a higher density of elements that can come together to form consciousness, resulting in a lot more of that sort of enemy. Or possessed swords, or possessed armor, that sort of concept. Then to build off of that, you take Septium, and it's basically sort of the same as my previous concept, where it's an unmanifested form of orbital energy. You see the Back Alley Doctor book, and you have a literal disease that people are transforming into Septium from a growth, sort of like cancer, honestly. The book never really explains what's actually happening. It just really understands the cause and effect from the point of it starting, but it doesn't really understand why it's changing into Septium. But my theory there would be the idea that it's basically unmanifesting. It changes back from the elements that it manifested into back into the Septium. And in a lot of ways, orbital energy sort of is similar to an atom in a sense. I think there's a lot of ideas for how it works that are probably based on current scientific concepts for how atoms work, but in a fantasy way. So that means orbital energy itself is sort of analogous to atomic energy. But Echo, you might ask, orbits can recharge. You even have EP to represent this. Well, I'd answer that with the idea that orbits don't actually initiate the manifestation. They simply leech off residual orbital energy in the same way that Septian veins created the world, and take that orbital energy that's emanated and manifest that instead. Think of it like electricity. There isn't actually a flow of atoms. It's not like anything's actually moving through the cable. All that stuff's still there. Really what's happening is you have electrons moving. The residual, the sort of electrons on the outer shell of an atom. And I'd actually argue that's the key difference between an artifact and the current modern day ordnance. Artifacts themselves are things that can directly control the orbital energy in its manifested form. It can change things at a very fundamental level, including the actual orbital energies that make up the world around it. So you have stuff where you can freeze time, you have stuff where you can if you think of any of the artifacts, ultimately they directly control stuff around it. They don't take energy and then create something. That's what all the ordnance do. All the artifacts actually control the world around it. It really does explain why artifacts can do so many spectacular things. And it's also probably why the church so much wants to control them, because that's where technology in the hands of people, ooh, that is a dangerous concept. Do not want that reverse engineered. This would actually explain why EP charges are even a thing. I don't typically try to explain gameplay mechanics too much, but you literally have an item that recharges your EP, which doesn't actually charge on its own during battle, which means it actually charges slowly. Same with out of battle. So basically you have that residual energy and you just keep it in a pack, and then you basically insert in and fill up whatever container you have through your orbment and how it works. And yeah, like I said, the source of all this would be whatever this church is calling the goddess, essentially. Which is less of a deity and more of the will of the world, in a sense? Think of it this way. If you have an ultimate source that has all these different elements, and you say, the elements of mirage, time, space are capable of coming together and creating consciousness, wouldn't any source, including all those things, be able to form a consciousness as well? Yeah, that's what I am currently thinking is Eidos. And that's what I'd consider the afterlife too. Your soul, your combination of those elements that make up you, return to that source. And then you can have situations where all that is brought back and reconstituted in the world. Like Kia with Guy at the end of Azure. Love, Rufina, all that sorts of stuff. It explains those things pretty well, doesn't it? And the real source of why I'm changing my mind a little bit and how this works is try to explain stuff like Potter Matter being given a soul. Why can AI have life? Well, in my mind, you could sort of attribute it to the fact that they have those Zemurian ore. I mean, remember, when we went back and got the Zemurian ore in Azure, there were 2 that were located at the location Joshua, Estelle, and Ren were. One that Joshua gave us, and one that we went back and picked up. There were 2. So one for Potter Matter, and one for the Ion. The Zemurian ore itself is grown from sepet veins and whatnot, so that's obviously going to be very closely connected to all that. And then he also had a connection to Ren herself, so even if he wasn't getting, like, that's literally how Potter Matter worked. He had, like, an actual, like, mental connection to Ren, right? That's, like, what the whole experimentation and why, it's actually why Ren was so compatible, right? Because she was also so compatible with the Gnosis stuff and being able to actually take a Gnosis and be connected to the sept-terrion, right? So you sort of have that combination of stuff where it sort of makes sense as to why Potter Matter could develop an actual soul, a consciousness, rather than just an AI over time. You also, and this might seem almost irrelevant, you had that literal side quest where you had living dolls. And it was just sort of like, oh, there's higher elements around. Yeah, that makes some sense, right? And you literally had a doll that had an entire personality that saw the other doll as a sister. It really feels like it adds up really well. You have a sept-terrion with a personality. You can have all these different concepts. You have Kia. And to note, it would also mean that all those people that were sacrificed before Kia, as well as anyone who was connected through the Gnosis and whatnot, whatever they lost through all that, is also sort of a part of her in a way and lives on in a way, so there's a little bit of, you know, ideas from that. It also made me, it's just like, while writing all this, it made me think, you know what? I think Reen is the actual reincarnation of Dreyfus. I think it's his soul reconstituted in a new person. I think that's literally how it works, and that's how Awakeners even work. I vaguely remember Vita saying something in Cold Steel about a cycle of souls and whatnot. And I think it was like at the end of Cold Steel when she was like chanting stuff. Here, let's find that. Okay, I wasn't able to find it. I know she mentioned that at some point, but I'm not going to go running through the entirety of the series to try to find exactly what I'm thinking of. But what was I talking about? Yeah, I think that's how Awakeners work, where they're literally the reincarnation of that same combination of a personality, essentially the soul, brought back into a new body, basically. I think that's how Awakeners work. That's why it recognizes them. I could be wrong, obviously, but still. It would also explain why the Vermilion Apocalypse needed an Arner pilot from the royal family, since he needed, I assume how babies are made involve transferring some of the higher element stuff and having that grow. So you have that in the same way as genetics. Let's talk about how babies are made in the Trails universe. It could also mean that Arianrod is a reincarnation of Lance Maiden, if she's not immortal. Wait, actually, would that mean she has a Divine Knight? She probably has a Divine Knight, doesn't she? She would! Okay, well, I look forward to that. And that was a little bit more rambly, but basically, I think it explains a lot without deviating much from the concepts I had otherwise. Like I said, if I went into trying to develop timelines to make sure everything's consistent, basically, there's a bunch of stuff I tried to explain via this. That's more than anything. I think this is a good first step. I'll come back to this after Cold Steel 3, and if it's not completely contradicted, then I'll probably expand on it for timeline-wise stuff. So that's the current state of my theory of everything. So we can go back to the Black Records now. So, something I noticed while looking at the Black Records, I noticed that there's more in Cold Steel 3. I haven't really looked at them, but there are new ones in Cold Steel 3. So, this is not the full story. It's a lot like the fragments, honestly. You get a little bit of a peek at them. Okay, the very first one. I haven't seen these in forever. The gods of creation. Before Septian calendar. In the beginning, there were 2 great gods. Considering people like to call gods sept-terrions, I wouldn't be surprised if those were sept-terrions. One boasted unrivaled courage, the other unparalleled fortitude. They descended from the heavens with their kin. The heavens. Which means there are more of them, so if they're sept-terrions, then that is actually describing when sept-terrions entered the world. It was dark upon the dark land below that they first met. Calamity. Their opposing natures are incompatible. The 2 were drawn irresistibly to battle, and thus began a struggle that shook heaven and earth. We know that sept-terrions can have personalities now, so I won't be too surprised. The gods and the spirits of laments were for naught. The land quaked, the skies were torn asunder, and the gods' kin can only tremble in fear. And after what seemed like an eternity, their clash came to an end. But it was an end in mutual defeat. Power spent, I think the shells of the 2 celestial titans were flung into the first reaches of the dark land. And all that remained were terrible, their kin, and the great power, which the divine knights are based off of. And that actually might explain what was happening with them recreating resurrecting, creating a new sept-terrion with Kia. They might have taken the leftover power from the then dead, basically, sept-terrion Mirage that was like not usable in its form, and then tried to create a new sept-terrion based on it with Kia as the core. So that would be my guess. So I imagine right now, if you go back to my reactions to Black Records originally, this is probably massively different. 5 games will do that to you. I wouldn't be surprised if Courage and Fortitude are actually trying to suggest at the elements they represent, if they are sept-terrions. Fortitude, Earth, Courage, Fire? Maybe? Would anything else represent fire? Wind? Maybe? Probably not. We haven't seen any of the non-higher element ones, so that'll be interesting at the very least. How exactly those work. Yeah, I'm fairly convinced this is supposed to be sept-terrions. It feels like it matches it very well. Black Records 2, The Dark Dragon. Year 3071, Septian calendar, 200 years after Heimdall was first founded. Ruin rose on monstrous wing from the depths of the earth. Its name was Azure Aguga, the Dark Dragon, the malevolent creature of terrible power. It spread miasma throughout the capital that turned Heimdall into a city of the dead. Hey! The undead, that's a thing in this world, apparently. I'm taking this a little bit at its word. The horrors did not end there. The evil dragon desecrated the corpses of the fallen, taking control of their bodies and using them to attack those who remained alive, further increasing the legions of the dead. The emperor at the time, Astorius II, was forced to flee the city with what remained of his households and citizens. Together, they retreated south and established a new city in the land of St. Arc, which we never went to. I bet we'll go there in one of the Cold Steel games coming up. I remember that being mentioned. It's probably a significant city. For 100 years, the Bane of Heimdall went unchallenged until Hector I, the 7th Emperor of Erebonia, resolved to recapture the city. How long did the legions of dead live? Probably pretty long, I imagine. A time had proven ally to the beast, however, and the dragon's influence had spread over the surrounding area like a plague. Undaunted Hector I led an army of brave knights into a necropolis in an attempt to free it. But though their hearts were steadfast, their arrival was met by legions of powerful fiends, and their efforts seemed doomed to end in failure. It was then that Hector I had a fateful encounter with none other than the great familiar knight, Testarossa, which means... Was this after Yeah, this is after the Great Collapse. Which means that the Divine Knights were already around, basically. The Divine Knight recognized Hector I as its master, and bolstered by its immense power and countless weapons, the Emperor moved once again on the city in decisive, to the decisive encounter with the Dark Dragon. The battle shook the city to its core, and in the end, the Vermilion Knight was victorious. The Scourge of Heimdall, the Dark Dragon, was defeated. However, the price for victory was steep. The corrupted blood that flowed from the dragon claimed Hector's life and defiled even the knight itself, placing a curse upon it. The noble Testarossa became the Crimson Calamity. How does that work? Did it, like, absorb the, consciousness of the dragon or something? Because we did have the dragon show up in, Cold Steel, remember? It was like a bone that was being, like a bone skeleton that was being controlled. Right, so it didn't really have much of a personality outside of being controlled, so I'm gonna base a lot of my thoughts going forward on the idea that consciousness is just like a combination of higher elements and it can be transferred or stuff like that. And you have like I'm gonna base a lot of what I talk about forward based on what I was talking about from a fundamental concept. The noble Testarossa became the Crimson Calamity, a demon with 1,000 weapons that only reacts to the blood of the Arner family. Destructive force on par with the Dark Dragon. That should control if a demon with 1,000 weapons that only. The noble Testarossa became the Crimson Calamity, a demon with 1,000 weapons that only reacts to the blood of the Arner family. A destructive force on par with the dragon. That, should the control of it ever be lost, would threaten the world and all who live in it. It was sealed deep underground, never intended again to see the light of day. Meanwhile, a new city rose from the ashes of the old, and the people once again began to gather in Heimdall. And that was when the Vermilion capital, that endures to this day, was first built. 3. War of the Lions. It's making me think about so much about Cold Steel that I haven't thought about in a long time. Year 947. The year 947, Emperor Valius V passed away. His death heralded the beginning of a large-scale civil war in Erebonian history. Valius V was a ruler with a somewhat debaucherous reputation and is said to have countless wives and concubines. To further complicate the matter of succession, many of those wives came from prestigious noble families, all of whom began competing for power and want their offspring to take the throne. Oh my. I hope many of them weren't married. Within days of Valius V's death, Crown Prince Manfred, the son of the first wife, was assassinated by an unknown party. Following the death of the Crown Prince, the fourth prince and the son to the Emperor Valius' secondary wives, Prince Orthros seized the capital by force once to control. He declared himself the new emperor and began purging all those who dared oppose him. The coup set off a succession of counterclaims, and 3 other princes named themselves the new emperor. Backed by powerful noble families of their mothers, the competing princes ignited a bloody 5-year-long civil war, and thus began the War of the Lions. At first, the princes' armies were largely equal in terms of strength. It wasn't until Orthros, who would later become known as the False Emperor, revived the being that had long been sealed under the city. The balance of power shifted. The Testarossa, the legendary Vermilion Knight, now tainted by the blood of Zora Agruga, saw the light of day once more. With its unmatched strength under its control, Orthros decimated the greatest competition in one fell swoop. The 5th Prince Gunnar was defeated. So for where Zoro Agruga came from, this is sort of tying back to my previous theory of everything in the Zero spoiler talk. The idea of why enemies always show up when things are like really like happening, where the entire world is sort of like its own plane of existence, that sort of thing. And you have like an outside world essentially, which might be where the source of powers come from and stuff, etc, etc, etc. That it probably came from the outside, basically. That would be my thought. It was unmatched strength under his control. Orthros estimated the greatest competition in one fell swoop. The 5th Prince Gunnar was defeated. It seemed inevitable the armies of the other princes would share in the same fate, but it was at this pivotal point that the war took yet another surprising turn. This unexpected development came in the form of another great knight, the Palatinate Knight, the famed champion that was acquired by Prince Lucius, the 6th and youngest of the feuding brothers. And with its power, he was able to defeat the army of the brilliant strategist and 2nd Prince Albert. Victorious and backed by the knight's power, Prince Lucius was poised to challenge Orthros, Prince Gunnar, Albert, and armies. Oh, and okay, I didn't write this down in my notes to mention it during the Theory of Everything stuff. That sort of reminds me that the reason I think like you have witches with like Emma and whatnot that can actually do magic and sort of like it also sort of explains them being able to do magic, because the same reason the previous stuff explained them. And also explains the, it sort of explains the stigmas, because they seem like they're sources of power rather than anything specific. or I think because it's traumatic, like trauma creates it, right? So I sort of imagine the stigmas are them getting connections, essentially, to a source of vast power. Something that isn't them, basically. And the trauma somehow connects them to it. I don't know how, but, you know. Possibly. Because, like, Wazi said something about his stigma taking the power of that artifact, right? And had a wheel and all that sort of stuff, so... And had the same, emblem on the, tab. The stone stab? Oh, I've been talking too long. Yeah, the thing. Slab. There it is. So, yeah. I think the stigmas are basically connections to completely different stuff. Yeah. Oh, Prince Gunnar and Albert's armies, however, were not completely wiped out inside to join forces with one another to oppose the other princes. Which thus the war became fought by three separate groups: Prince Orthros, the Vermilion Knight, Prince Lucius, the Felonate Knight, and Princes Gunnar and Albert, who had no knight, but compensated with their sheer numbers. The war of the Lions have been raging for 2 years now, and the chaos only worsened by the day Erebony seemed fated to fall into ruin, and darkness fitting perhaps for a nation that takes its name from Erebos. And Drykels. A young man lays upon a grassy plain, enjoying a nap, peaceful setting. Before long, he's interrupted by the man on horseback. They basically called him, yeah, you gotta go help. No claim to the throne to his commoner mother. And he'd been ignored. Left to his own devices. Mother passed away. He told him something that would remain from him. The blood flowing through you will not allow you to turn your back on the Empire's suffering. And Prince Drykos had turned those words over in his head over and over again. What could a powerless vagrant like himself truly hope to do? Yes, it's English. Thanks, website. The knight's arrival, however, signified two things. The war would continue to worsen, and the Erebony was the path to ruination. His mother was probably correct. Hearing the knight's words, he decided that enough was enough. He could ignore the pain of his countrymen no longer. The knight, incidentally, was called Roland. He was a childhood friend of Drykos and was his confidant. He was also the man who Drykos had left in charge of things in this place before leaving the country. Prince Drykos set about preparing to depart. Before he could finish, he was met by several of the tall knights of Nord. Their cross-shaped spears in hand, they too were close friends of Drykos. They volunteered to accompany him and Roland, fearing that the two men alone would not stand a chance. Next morning, the prince departed the village, with mere 17 men under his command. They bade farewell to the people of the settlement, and its elder wished them well. May the winds of the gods be with you. He bless them. Favor fortune you all. And 5. The war comes to an end. Yeah, it becomes less interesting the farther ahead in time you go. Because it just becomes history at a point. It stops becoming like, that makes me think. Yeah, I'm not as interested in straight history. Prince Drykos opponents were the armies of the 4th Prince Orthros and Knight, Lieutenant Knight, and the remaining combined forces, who had a legion of magical golems under control. When did that happen? How did that happen? Yeah, I remember this showing up in Cold Steel 2 particularly, but yeah. It was he, the illegitimate son of commoner and latecomer of the war, who emerged triumphant. Victory did not come without losses, however. During his return to Erebony, Roland fell in battle. Not long after that, however, he met a woman who would change his destiny forever. This woman is none other than the daughter's Count Sandlot, who hailed from Lake Santana the Ground. Her charismatic personality and peerless skills with the lance earned her the leadership of a band of knights. Also known as the Eisenritter and moniker Lance Maiden, her name was Leon Sandlot. Prince Drykos and Leon Sandlot have come from wildly different backgrounds, but their concern for innocent victims of war united them in purpose to bring an end to the bloodshed, and it was those shared feelings that made them join forces. The two of them, along with the warriors of Nord, the Eisenritter, all the peoples of the nation whose hearts were moved to liberate one town after another, and eventually successfully persuaded even Prince Lucius, owner of the Palatinate Knight, to fight for their sorry. At the same time, however, the false emperor schemed to elevate the cursed Vermilion Light to even greater power to godhood, and thus the Vermilion Apocalypse was created. The demonic god emerged in Heimdall alongside the monstrous cast on Vanquish, the approaching armies of Albert Gunnar in a single battle. Their end was anything but conventional. How did he push it to godhood? That's a good question. I figure it's connected to a sept-terrion. Huh. The demonic god emerged in Heimdall alongside Amatra's castle and vanquished the approaching armies of Albert and Gunnar in a single battle. Their end was anything but conventional, however, they were simply erased from existence. I don't know how seriously I should take that. Literally, I suppose. Even the Palatinate Knight could not contend with the foe and was felled, and as it decimated all who challenged the false emperor, countless crimson spirit veins spread out from the castle, stealing away the very life from the capital's citizens, as well as those in the surrounding areas. Doesn't that sound familiar? Defeat seemed all but inevitable for Prince Dracos and the Lance Maiden and their followers, but they refused to give up. Following the guidance of a kindly witch, they were led to a new great knight which slumbered on the outskirts of Heimdall. Kindly witch, eh? After overcoming a trial, they were able to claim the Ashen Knight in its power. With it in hand, along with their many supporters and army Prince Lucius, they marched on the capital for the final time, eventually making their way to the castle in the center. 3 days later, on the 4th of July, year 952, the castle vanished from existence and the city was liberated. Okay. No mention of Sandlot getting a Divine Knight. Maybe not, but it seems weird if she didn't. It actually seems pretty likely that she had one, right? Yeah, maybe I'm just like speculating a bit much. Okay, well, I don't think there's a ton more to take from all that outside of the, you know, Septine veins, and I bet there's Phleroma grass sitting around there. So basically, if I were going to take anything from that, it would be predictions for Cold Steel 3, right? Particularly that there's going to be 2 sept-terrions? Probably. If I were to guess fire and earth. Might be the biggest thing to take from it. And probably that the great power is what was left behind between them two, in the same way that Azure's Mirage Demiurgus left behind, I assume, power that Kia was able to combine with as a new core for it. So yes, I did want to finish this with some Cold Steel 3 predictions. Those weren't part of them, but those are now part of them. Because I had not read all that again for quite some time. I did it. So the first thing I want to know is I have watched the opening. I watched it, honestly, a long time ago. And when I watched it more recently, I noticed there's like a crow Spores Ritter looking guy in it. So I'm gonna go ahead and call that now. That guy's totally Crow Spores Ritter style. Like Love had Spores Ritter, right? I'm gonna call that now. And I'm not sure what all that's going to mean, but yeah. I'm gonna predict that it's gonna be a much more personal story for Cold Steel 3. It's gonna be more on the down low and have to do with character development to a point where at the end there's going to be a plot twist where everything becomes international and stuff, right? That's my prediction. A very grand scale for Cold Steel 4 as a result. That's my prediction. As for what that ending stinger is, the easy route would be a war. The easy war option would be Erebonian versus Calvard. The other possibility would be that Reen, given his whole ogre form and stuff like that, and he has something inserted into him, that he could be sort of Kia-like. Maybe he's meant to be a core for another sept-terrion, since we literally, especially after reading that, the Black Record stuff, it sounds like the sept-terrions died in the same way, and they're not really accessible. That maybe Reen's intended to be the core for another sept-terrion. Maybe that's the point behind what Osborne did with him when he was younger. If I were to go out on a ledge there, I'd actually say that if I had to take a prediction, I'd say Reen is a homunculus Kia style, and he's not actually Osborne's son. He's just his son in a way where he remembers him when he was left on the doorstep, right? So, maybe. I don't really think those are going to happen. It feels like it would be a bit too copying what they already did with Kia. But, and honestly, a lot of my mind is like, sort of going back to like, well, now I'm looking at the parallels and stuff they already did, and it's like, oh, could they do that again? Could they expand on it? Could they do something else of that nature? Or anything else like that? So, the question to whether he is actually Kia-like, where he can, like, I suppose maybe not Kia-like, maybe more like he's connected to a sept-terrion to the point where he can, in that sense, sort of go white hair in the same way Echochamber did at the end. Oh yeah, and that was one other thing. The, didn't... What's his face? Oh, I forget. I'm never gonna remember his name. The guy that, at the beginning of Azure, when he, like, did full demonization, his hair never turned white, right? Maybe that was the difference? But yeah, Reen's hair turns white like him, which means that's probably a result of whatever is in him, like McBurn was talking about. And if McBurn's made of all of it, and I'm assuming that what's put in him is like some essence of the sept-terrion, that sort of thing, then I'd assume that McBurn, being made all of it, would mean that the sept-terrion in question would probably be fire. You can go out on a limb and say that. I'm actually fairly confident we're going to see a fire sept-terrion now that I think about all this. As for what any of this means, I'd say that my prediction for Cold Steel 3's story would be something along the lines of... So Reen's state at the end of Cold Steel 2 was that he was really unhappy, but he was going through with it in order to reduce the, because he knew it was going to happen anyway, to reduce the number of casualties involved in, like, controlling Crossbell and presumably anywhere else that was taken over. I believe, was it Northumbria? Yeah, I believe it also said in the stuff I read way back when I did, like, the Cold Steel 2 spoiler talk, I believe there's talks about how that was taken over in the time in between the games. So my guess would be that Reen is trying... So my guess would be that the story of Cold Steel 3 basically follows Reen as he is essentially trying and, I don't know, maybe failing to try to find a new path that sort of detaches him from all that, basically. It's hard to say why. It has to be more personal, and it's probably going to be centered around Reen's. It's hard to say what. It's probably going to be more personal, and I have a hard time imagining any other storyline except centering it around Reen's potential growth from that state. So, I don't know. I had another few things that I was going to throw out there on a limb. Oh, this was an interesting thought. I'm not convinced of this, but the idea that the Grandmaster is the consciousness of Eidos, expelled from, like, how I was talking about how the goddess itself is like this source of power and orbital energy, and then because you have all the higher elements there too, it can form a consciousness. So take that consciousness, expel it, put it in a mortal body. Grandmaster. There's an idea. And that might be at the point of the Great Collapse even. I have nothing to support that. I don't even think it makes that much sense. It's just an idea that came to mind that I wanted to mention. So I've been on so many topics here that I don't even know if this came across coherently in the end. If you have any questions about anything I said that I didn't maybe elaborate on enough, or anything like that, maybe ask. I'll try to answer any questions. If I don't have an answer, I'll at least try to say. So that has been Trails to Azure. This should be going up on the day Cold Steel 3 releases. So that means I should be releasing an episode of that by tomorrow. Cold Steel 3. Cold Steel 3. Hell yeah! So, yeah. It's interesting because, like, playing through Sky and whatnot, whenever I looked at Cold Steel 3 stuff, or just like basically going watching the opening, was like 99% of it, or seeing artwork and thumbnails and stuff like that. And yeah, that's something that's worth noting too. I've seen artwork and thumbnails, so I've seen a lot of the character artwork from, like, I know Lloyd's coming back, I know Estelle's coming back, that sort of stuff. In what capacity? I don't really know, but I've seen artwork in, like, thumbnails and whatnot on YouTube. It's the nature of what it is. I'm still able to avoid any significant spoilers, but stuff like that's probably pretty typical. Combine that with looking up images for thumbnails, and yeah, it's inevitable. But yeah, thinking back to, like, in Sky, it's like, I enjoyed those games, but it sort of got to the point where, like, I was like, man, I can't wait for Cold Steel 3. Like, this stuff is good, but it's just making me more excited for Cold Steel 3. And then the Crossbell stuff, it might be because I rushed through so much of it that I'm actually not as straight up excited for Cold Steel 3 as I would have been like a year ago. Mind you, whenever I go and when I go and do stuff that actually directly interacts with the game, like I see an email saying that my order was confirmed recently, and hopefully that ships. I'll buy it digitally if it doesn't ship in time anyways. I don't care, I'll buy it multiple times, I want to support the series. When I see that, the excitement comes back, so maybe it's just because it doesn't feel quite real to me, and the Crossbell games were a really good return to a lot of the things that I liked about Cold Steel that Sky wasn't quite up to, especially in terms of musical production value and sort of how it did storytelling and etc, 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 where it just evolved. You can see the improvements over time. But it's interesting because I'm not like just in the everyday just like thinking about it. I'm not as excited as I would have been like a year, 2 years ago even. So yeah, so that has been Trails to Azure. I think that's where I'm going to leave it off. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Cold Steel 3 coming soon. So I'll see you all next time. Roll the tape and drive safely.